This is not what we're having in Britain. And, you know, from our words to their ears, get ready for change, because, you know, we've had enough of all of this, and we need to get Britain back to a position where the things that really count and matter get dealt with.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Alan Miller from Together Association says the people of Britain are fed up and 2025 will bring big changes.
We've seen people be in prison not just for shouting at dogs or for saying things on social media, not even being at a protest and not even calling for anything but just making comments. But also we've seen imprisonments of people for refusing to call people they and things like that. I mean, we've got all sorts of things that you couldn't make up and that are absolutely unacceptable.
Alan talks about growing restrictions on drivers.
We've seen in the Midlands over 50,000 people appeal the Clean Air Zone fines, and they've won. And people are furious with these things.
And the need for freedom to be built into technological progress.
There are some really good benefits to the developments in technology. They should be accessed and harnessed by us, but we need to ring fence and separate that from state intrusion and surveillance and this obsession that, you know, technocrats have got with managing all of us as though we're kind of vectors of all sorts of terrible things.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Association. Alan, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
So 2024 has been quite an eventful year, and you and the Together campaigners were in the thick of a lot of it. What do you feel was the most significant event of 2024?
Well, we're not quite finished it yet, and you know how things can change really fast. But I think, look, in the UK, obviously, we've seen a situation where there's been a new government brought in. It has a huge majority, but with far fewer votes than in recent history, and that really reflects a problem, which is a lack of belief in conviction in you know, partly in elected representatives, because people have become so disappointed that they've given clear instructions. And they've been ignored. So I think there's been an element of that and disgust. But there's also been, in light of that all happening, some real concerns around things like free speech and the rights to protest, and the two-tier policing and judicial system that's looking like the sorts of thing we used to see in other countries happening here. So from August onwards in particular, but throughout the year, how some behaviour and some things that are being said and done are treated one way and others are not. So we don't have a without fear or favour. And I'm a free speech absolutist. I think that that's very different to incitement, but you know, you should be able to speak freely, and we must be allowed to speculate. There's been speculation by government, by others, that people who are upset with borders or sovereignty are all far right or all this or all that. But when people speculate if someone kills many children, could they possibly be part of something? Somehow that's beyond the pale and could be illegal. It's unacceptable, and the British public see this. And so I've been very concerned about that. At Together, we think that the antiseptic for freedom is debate and discussion. You shine a light on ideas with fellow citizens, even if we're really opposed, that we must be able to discuss these things. And to hear the new Prime Minister immediately step to the idea that we're going to have banning orders for protests, and we're going to have and the head of the Home Office saying that, you know, we're going to move fast on people and imprison them. And we've seen people be in prison not just for shouting at dogs or for saying things on social media, not even being at a protest and not even calling for anything but just making comments. But also we've seen imprisonments of people for refusing to call people they and things like that. I mean, we've got all sorts of things that you couldn't make up and that are absolutely unacceptable, while at the same time others say and do things and are not addressed in the same way. And I think the British public's very concerned. I think it's very dangerous. But the other big thing that we've seen, of course, haven't we? We've seen what's happened in the United States and the election and the huge impact that this new group of people has made that is really, really quite astonishingly. I mean, I don't know what you think, but just seeing people like Tulsi Gabbard and Robert Kennedy Jr., as well as Marco Rubio and a range of other people in this new smorgasbord, perhaps we should say, with the new Donald Trump new incumbency that's pending in the inauguration in January, and seeing how many young people, a mixed group of people from across America, blue collar, many others who just feel they've not been represented, they've been treated with disdain and contempt, much like we feel in Britain, a lot of people feel. And I know there's a big sort of, they're trying to ravel, like they have a cavalry approach to say, oh, look how terrible it is, billionaires funding like free speech. I think the thing is that I don't care who's funding free speech, right? If what's happened with the X and what was Twitter is that for the first time we had less shadow banning, less censorship, less smearing of people, and free open debate. And people don't like it when it's a clear deck, it seems, right? And actually, it's looking like in Britain, some people want to start postponing and offsetting elections because a new political party may be getting more of them in the locals in May. And who knows for the generals, right? So I think that sort of authoritarian, weak authoritarian impulse, we've seen more of that in light of what we've seen in the last few years get consolidated. We've seen more of the types of things in our public sector and our private sector with these ESG and EDI resolutions and in teacher training, police training. But really excitingly, we've seen a lot of pushback from the public. And it really, I think now a moment for together, what's so inspiring is we've now seen many more people come out. We've seen people in the care sector argue and articulate issues that they've got. We've seen people, drivers, 37 million drivers in Britain, right, being shut down, limited, roadblocks, surveillance, ignored. But we've been working with all of them, and now we've seen the farmers say that this is unacceptable, and small and medium-sized businesses getting involved as well, the public rallying around them, and we're going to be, we can talk more about that, but this is an exciting moment for Britain and for people to think there are new ways to do things. It's not going to be just the same old of like you're either Labour or you're Conservative, and actually we're all technocrats and there's not much can be done. We prefer Davos to Westminster. I think those times are going to be changing very rapidly, and particularly from January onwards.
We've seen quite a few digital freedom issues. CBDCs is one, online safety bill, and then also these digital ID cards in pubs and clubs. The Prime Minister said, don't be worried, it won't be mandatory. And do you think we should be worried?
Whenever they tell you don't be worried, that's the warning sign. We're not going to have vaccine passports. Don't be worried about, and then all of a sudden you get that. It's the kind of seeding and nudging and prompting. And, look, here's the thing about all of this. There are some really good benefits to the developments in technology. They should be accessed and harnessed by us. But we need to ring fence and separate that from state intrusion and surveillance and this obsession that, technocrats have got with managing all of us as though we're kind of vectors of all sorts of terrible things. And particularly around the idea of having some kind of reward or punishment system if you don't, dispose of your refuse in the right way, or if you go on one too many holidays, or if you drive in the wrong part of town where there's a roadblock. All of these things alongside the idea of a programmable currency, a central bank digital currency that can be programmable based on your decisions. That's enough petrol, that's enough food, you shouldn't perhaps be going there. These all seem like really far-fetched potentially, but remember, we were locked away in our houses, and that seemed like it would not even be a possible notion for a movie just a few months before that. You would have got laughed out the room. So when we talk about these measures, like on free speech, the Online Safety Act, we see how they get weaponized. We see what happens with Ofcom, very partisan, very particular with the way it makes decisions. We see what the BBC Verify does in terms of what it investigates, what it calls disinformation, how it uses, for instance, Labour activists to say, yes, it is 500 farms that will be impacted, not a year, not 70 or 75,000 in total. You can see how these things have a danger to be utilised for control that is anti-democratic, anti-sovereign, anti-people, anti-freedom, anti-individual privacy. And we need to make sure that we don't have those things happen. So as far as it goes around pubs and clubs and everything, if we're honest, we've had a situation for some time where there's been facial recognition and ID cards with ID on there. Now some are trying to have facial recognition like you've got in some retail. There's a problem with that. Where the issue is, there's an obsession that somehow you deal with these things like what they call antisocial behaviour, but we should remember around bars and clubs, behaviour is better than it's ever been before. I mean, certainly in the last 3 decades, you don't really get fights and terrible things. For the most part, you get people meeting, lighting up the streets. It's all very regulated. We do have issues with crime in some areas, but it's not at bars and clubs and with hospitality now. They're in other areas, and we could have that conversation, and they do need to get addressed. But this push to constantly regulate, control, see who's doing what and how, what the state should be focused on is supporting infrastructure projects, making sure engineering, big, large-scale developments, roads and house building infrastructure. You can do bonds and you can do support, bring private and public initiatives together with a vision to the future. Let's have some big thinking, right? Let's think about how, space travel. Let's think about things that can move under the ground real fast. Let's think about all the different options we've got. I'm all about that. I think that's great. Together we think that productivity, investment, being able to fail but have retraining. There's lots of areas we can do stuff. Not constantly regulating our private movements, our decisions as individual citizens, constantly nudging, pushing, telling us to behave in a certain way, like with the ESG, environmental, societal governance, you need to do this in this way, or EDI, equity, diversity and inclusion, which often is not particularly inclusive and is not that diverse because it has a very particular set of ideas that are very discriminatory quite often. And I think that that's the thing in terms of concerns, people's legitimate concerns with digital ID, with central bank digital currency. And that's why we were so happy that we were able to campaign to have cash kept. We got over 50,000 respondents to the consultation with the Bank of England. And they responded to that, recognising it. We also campaigned with the FCA to make sure that people couldn't be deplatformed for having opinions with their banks. That actually was about to be passed in legislation. We worked with all sorts of people like Us for Them, Free Speech Union and others. And as it was about to be delivered, the snap election was called. I mean, all of this seems like so long ago now, right? But it's very recent. And we've been consistently campaigning about road closures and roadblocks, digital ID, the idea that you link digital ID to people's driving and behavioural habits, all of those things. So we would say, the state should be focused on some very specific things. Maybe build a few hospitals, maybe build a few schools, fire stations, and let us have an entrepreneurial spirit. Let the public get on with what it needs to do. Have a separation between our ideas and an individual conscience, and the state should, and really it needs to be trimmed down. We've got all these civil servants that block what democratically elected people have been brought in to do, have said they're going to do, and you've got a civil servant saying we're not going to do it, or we're going to. All of that needs to get resolved, and I actually think that this next year ahead is going to be really exciting for all of that.
We've seen the farmer protests. Jeremy Clarkson had his Together sign. Why is what's happening to the farmers important to all of us non-farmers?
Well, farming is the backbone of Britain. It's part of our heritage and culture and way of life. But let's look at what's happened with energy, energy security. We don't have it. And that's a big problem. When you look at some things that are happening internationally, we're told, well, because of Russia and Ukraine or because of other things in the Middle East. But, at any one point, this obsession with net zero and how we've done things or not done things, we're now in a situation where we're often paying vessels to bring our energy from other nations and paying much more if you're going to use a carbon footprint point, I don't like to use it, but if you are, with a much bigger carbon footprint, it's virtue signalling that's making us poorer, more at risk and prone to the changes internationally and globally. Food security. right? If we have a situation where we lose our farmers locally, regionally, nationally, and they become just a few black rocks or all for solar panels, then all of a sudden we don't have a situation where we have our food security. We have the ability to feed our people. Now, we've got brilliant generational family farmers here, and there's a big discussion that we need to have about food locally, how it's grown, what it means for us, price points, investment. Why would anyone want to continue in a business where the return on investment is like 0.5%, excuse me? And this silly idea that they're just all wealthy aristocrats. You know, like some spad in the Labour inner circle has gone, oh yeah, well this lot didn't vote for us and the city people will all hate them. Don't worry, we'll nod this through. And I don't think they realised quite what was going to happen. Contemptuous, completely, forget reading the room, right? Just disdainful for, you know, working people, right? People who work really hard. Sure, they may have a number of assets. You know, a combine harvester can cost £750,000. Yeah. Tractors cost hundreds of thousands. When you add that up, maybe with a bit of livestock or with some buildings, we're not talking about a flat or a house in London, though. We're talking about the fact if you have to dispense with that when someone dies, if you're the, you know, great-great-great-great-grandchild of someone that's continued all of that investment and that development and that legacy, and you then have to sell that off, and then increasingly we don't have farmers doing that, or we have one or two big corporations who, by the way, are also the ones that are behind doing the surveillance cameras, and they're also the ones that are doing private security companies in our streets. All of these things are concerning because the democratic control of things and the impulse and the ability for the public to have these things there, and a few very wealthy entities that have their own interests. When people talk about globalism, right, they're not interested particularly in sovereign rights of British people, right? They've got a global outlook. Where do they best return for their particular dividends and shareholders? And I'm not opposed to people making lots of money. I think it's a great thing to do. But there's an issue about the concentration of power and control, particularly with something as vital as our food. And I think that, you know, we have lost a sense a bit in Britain about what hard work and duty and sacrifice and these measures are, but the public recognises that in our farmers. I mean, you mentioned Jeremy Clarkson. I think his TV shows have really shown people just how hard and how difficult it is, how well they work, how many solutions they come up with. And we're thrilled that, you know, Jeremy was holding our placard, and the sense that, and this is the thing about Together, we are supporting our farmers, but also small, medium-sized enterprises, that all our businesses that are exactly the same are going to be impacted by this egregious, not thought out. I mean, some people actually think it is thought out, and it's a conscious attempt to just suffocate it, like we've seen in America, some very big entities, Bill Gates and others, buying up loads of farmland. And the concentration of capital happens quite often. I think we need to be able to say, this is how we want to curate our economy, our food options, and it's always better when you've got lots of different entities that are doing it and contributing. I was just down in Wales, and I'd actually been to Clarkson's farm, which was great, and seen them there. And I went to Wales, and we got great milk from the local dairy farmers, and there's a great store. Hugh and the guys out there have got their food, all their great, really lovely local foods, really tasty, yummy. And you just think, look, I know it's expensive quite a lot of the time for people to shop like that, but it doesn't have to be, right? If we get our act together, we can work out. There are always incentives and way that we can do things, but we need to have that conversation with the public in Britain. And I think that make America healthy again conversation, and we've seen Jay Bhattacharya, you know, Asim Malhotra and others are all involved in some of that conversation. Here, that's essential, right? We just think, how can we do things, not the state tells you you must run 5 miles a day, not that, but having an honest discussion about our food, processed food, local food, our farmers, you know, what it all means, how we can have those choices and those options, and have our food security, right? We need to have that, like water security and energy. It's really essential.
Yeah. I mean, the government's showing no signs of backing down. The farmers obviously won't back down. Where do you think it's going to end up?
Right now, there's some more farmers that are out in Devon, Cornwall and Somerset as we speak. We're posting about it. We're talking and working with lots of people. There are people that are doing very exciting things with counties around Britain. So we've seen a big rally on the 19th in London. We've also seen tractors come out on the 11th of December. 900 or so, the police think. I mean, it was really tremendous. Matt Cullen and the guys from Dover. But now there are things all around the country that are going to be happening. And today is just a little pre-demonstration of things. But this government would be well advised to sit down and reflect and turn things around, because they're not going to win this. The public are behind our farmers, and the farmers are going to. They're in an existential crisis moment. They're not going to just, if you say to people, you've just got your end of your way of your life or your family situation, they'll have to sell it off. Why would you invest in something if you're going to be penalised again for investing in fixing a roof or investing in crops? I invest in this, and then because I've done that, I have a bit more wealth on paper, even though I'm not making proper revenue from it, which then, when I get a bit older, I've got to die off, and we've got to sell it off and by the way, inheritance tax, let's just have it straight. We pay capital gains tax. We pay income tax. What is this great idea we're all paying inheritance tax again? Tax all over again. In Britain, it's so difficult to make money. It's so difficult to, we've got a cost of living crisis. We've had huge costs increase in energy in lots of areas because we haven't had proper investment in infrastructure, in reservoirs, in nuclear, in a whole range of areas. Then we've had the magic money tree where they just kind of do quantitative easing and say, right, and we'll do that right through lockdown. Stay at home if you're middle class. And stay at home and we'll pay you. What do you mean? And we're paying for all this. And we love our NHS, we've got to pay for it more. How do you think it gets paid for, right? It gets paid for through hard graft and commerce. But if people can't afford to do it, that's why so many people are going to places like Dubai and Singapore, young people. And we need to address that here, right? It is untenable that people are now thinking, well, I might not be able to continue in my farm. That is a very dangerous moment. I've seen that happen in hospitality with bars and clubs and others, and I've seen what it's meant for cities and in terms of, dynamic, exciting, transformative, bringing tech and housing replenishment and regenerating areas. And particularly since lockdowns, we've lost tens of thousands of venues and hospitality people. That has consequences for a whole area. Now, you do that with farms, we're going to see what's going to happen. We can't allow that to happen.
You mentioned the pubs and clubs. We just keep losing more and more of them. My village used to have 7 pubs, now we have 3.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about that? Where's that going to end up?
Well, it's a subject very close to my heart. I spent, 3 decades in putting on events in clubs, bars. We developed the Ultra Brewery in Brick Lane, using the Vibe Bar as a kind of catalyst for all of that. And I've done it all around the world. I've spoken in cities around the world with policymakers and stakeholders about how destination hubs are created through nightlife. We only need to think about Carnaby Street. If you think about Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren and the King's Road, you think about fashion. Fashion was impossible without music and the dance culture. From the post-war period in the 50s onwards, the dance floor is what's been a catalyst. If you think about things like some of our best hoteliers now, who were right at the forefront of the club scene, in New York and in London and elsewhere. We've got a situation where how do you get a new generation of Stormzy's or Adele's and all of that? It's often the dance floor, and this is a huge part of our soft power, but also on our balance books. But also, when you have it in the city, where you have bars and clubs, there's a multiplier effect. You have all sorts of secondary, tertiary companies that get business, that people come in, it lights up the streets. If you think about Asian 24-hour night markets, we have or intergenerational, all those things go on. Now when I spent a lot of time advocating and educating policymakers, and in the UK with the Treasury, the Home Office, with the police and councils, and we turned the narrative and the conversation around. We helped create positions of night ambassadors in London, Manchester, Bristol. Unfortunately, they've been weaponised by some people, like the Mayor of London. They turned them into positions that they were really under their jurisdiction. And we said, don't do that. Keep them independent, like they've been in Amsterdam and Berlin. But we managed to change things around. And then the lockdowns came. And all the things about lighting things up and opening them up and transforming them got shut down. And it's a huge concern, Lee, right? You know, you've said it. I was just in another village in Norfolk, and there's one pub left, and there were 7 there. And these are places that from a long history, it's one of the reasons why ideas are able to spread. And you think about saloons and inns and the Enlightenment and all of that, much of that happened in coffee bars, and they're places of meeting and networking and transformation and ideas flourishing, and was the spine of our country, how people moved around and talked. And, you know, the idea that you work from home and then just sit at home and you don't meet people, or you just have go and get a wine or whatever from, isolated, insular. I think the sense of being able to be engaged with one another is really essential. I think that, there's costs that are ever increasingly put onto hospitality. So you've got to have more security, surveillance, all the energy prices went up. So the cost of delivering a beer or a cocktail is high, and the margins are low, even when you have a full place, right? But we need to think about the ability for people to run later, to have things like apartments and buildings around that, where younger people or people who are happy to have that activity go on around them. Triple glazing, like they've created in Amsterdam, where you have areas that are 24 hours, but also quiet zones. If you come from another country here and you're in the recording studio or you're doing business and you want to go out at 1 in the morning after you finish work, it's very difficult to do that here. We're meant to be an international city. This is the same in Manchester and Newcastle, Birmingham, Sheffield, Edinburgh, Glasgow. We need to get this resolved. I stopped. I handed over the Nighttime Industry Association. I was a founding a founder with some others and the chair. But together we have a lot of hospitality businesses. We did Open for All as well. And in the next incarnation now, with businesses, working with farmers and others, we're going to be articulating a lot more about what this means for the economy, for our culture, our way of life, and why we all should work together and to make sure our voices are heard, and to say this is the kind of Britain that we want to have in the future and have the public involved in that. We want a manifesto, effectively, that the public's engaged with, believes in, and that can feel like it has some control or over the destiny of our lives. And it's not just decisions that are made elsewhere by some other think tank or global organisation, but it's something that's true and authentic to us here, and that's really essential.
Do you think we've somehow kind of lost this entrepreneurial boundary-pushing spirit in Britain?
So I think that our obsession with limits, the so-called sustainable development, an oxymoron if ever there was one, the disgust for risk, and this sense that you should never have risk, the risk-averse society, this idea that you manage risk, you have judgment and discretion, but failure in America, failure is often seen as part of a recipe for success, because I learned the most from losing businesses and having failures. You don't learn as much when you're successful. You go, oh, yeah, I did that well. But if you lose something and then you carry on and you want to persevere, and you will always remember. I always remember having to give the office back in Denmark Street, Tin Pan Alley, after doing the first ever Ibiza reunion tour around Britain, and we did it with DJ Magazine and others at the time. Acid Jazz Records, who were based in the building, and I was gutted, right? We were on TV doing all these things, it was fantastic, and then you're like, it didn't work out. But the experience of paying everyone and saying I'm going to still persevere and everything meant that I forged relationships that lasted a lifetime in London and elsewhere. That then I brought Freeze, who were a magazine, who were tiny at the time, in that office opposite us, to come and do their first ever event at the Old Truman Brewery. And they went, wow, this is amazing. And Freeze has become the biggest art show in the world now. They've done an incredible job. These are the types of things that we need to encourage. We need to allow our zombie companies to fail, not keep saying you're too big to fail. We need to have retraining. We need to have serious people that are committed to value. We need to have people, if they're going to be in the Department for Business and Enterprise, have done some business and some enterprise. We need to have people at school that are not just told you've got to be safe all the time and limits, and we've got to make sure our planning is, we dispense with a lot of bureaucracy. We need to say with health and safety, yeah, health and safety is important, but at what point does it become prohibitive and stop us from actually being dynamic? Britain was the leading engineering nation of the world. What's happened? We're still the 6th biggest economy, right? So I'm not going to be all down on Britain. We can do a lot. And if you look at pockets, we've got like around Tech City, around the hubs, we've got some equity investors and we've got some of these. It's nothing like Silicon Valley, but we have some interesting things going on. We need to put that on steroids for tunneling, for tidal, for nuclear energy, for new universities, for new transportation, not limits, not surveillance, not restrictions, but productive growth, dynamic wealth creation for everyone. Get out of the way, let people try, let them fail, get better. That's the way it always works, right? People try and fail and get better. That's how the human journey has got us to where we've got to. And if we become sclerotic, bureaucratic, limiting, that has terrible consequences for us. And also it's fun and it's exciting and dynamic and we can go out there and take risks but use our judgment. This is the thing. The whole narrative is that our judgment is just killing everything, destroying everything. We're like termites and locusts. We've got to be limited, restricted. We're nasty. Gammons, racists, deniers. Please, we need a breath of fresh air and say let's take the Leonardo approach. Let's take the approach that we are all capable of wonderful things in science, in the arts, the best that is thought and said ever, the Matthew Arnold point, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the things that are so great. We've seen it from Persian culture and Indian culture as well, like some of the great scripts. Let's harness the best that we've seen and have a new type of Renaissance, future-oriented, but with the great traditions of our past. Let's not try and say we need to decolonize absolutely every part of our education system and our heritage, but we've got things we're very proud of that are remarkable. I mean, I grew up in Britain. I'm so thankful for being in a place where we've had democracy and we've had these ideas of rights, freedoms, liberties, and look, it's not, there are problems in Britain and we challenge them, but we're not still, even though Bernie Spofforth got a knock on the door for saying some things, we're still not a country where we think that's okay for the most part. And we're not about to let that happen. And there's great things here. And I think it's all dependent on us. Do we want to assert our autonomy? Do we want to shape our destiny? And in this year ahead together, that's going to be a big part of what we're encouraging people to get involved with.
I wanted to ask you a bit about some of the traffic freedom issues. ULEZ, low traffic neighbourhoods, 20 mile an hour speed limit. These things haven't been discussed quite so much recently because so many other things have been happening, but they're still quite important, right?
They're very important. One of the reasons why Wales looks like, I think that Wales is going to go another way in 2025, 26 in terms of elections. But people are furious. 20 miles an hour, emergency vehicles limited. But just how contemptuous with just these blanket assertions without proper discussion that are just arbitrary, and then you assert these things, it's for the air or the environment. You say, you're talking nonsense now at this point. We know our air quality is better than almost all our competitors, and in the last 10 years it's been transformed. It's nothing to do with going between 30 or 20. So then they say, well, it's less harmful and impacts. So you say, well, on that basis you say don't do anything, which is what some of them will say. Don't come out of the building. And how much do you weigh up risk and reward? And how important is travelling and the freedom of movement and be able to do it? Look, if you're around the school, I get it. The local community decides that's what it is, fine. But a blanket ban like that, 20 miles an hour, the idea that everywhere you go now, we're just being fleeced with fines and we're going at sort of 6 miles an hour in London. We've seen in the Midlands over 50,000 people appeal the clean air zone fines, and they've won. And people are furious with these things, and these ongoing attacks on the public where we just get extra taxes and extra fines and extra limits and nudges and restrictions, and you can't move in traffic and everyone's frustrated, but then there's all these streets that are empty, and the consequences for everyone of that needs to be dealt with. We need to, as we say, free our streets. We need to have the public engaged in these discussions and not treat them with disdain and contempt. And I think that's what's coming down the line now. We're seeing a lot more people standing up saying we've had enough of this, and we don't want our country to go that way.
We saw in Croydon some residents bring this judicial review against the council. They were saying their low traffic neighbourhood was for financial solutions rather than environmental. And do you think that's an anomaly, or do you think we'll see more pushback like that?
So, it's really interesting about Croydon because I think that, they had a lot of problems there, and I encourage people to do that. I am slightly, just a word of warning to people that courts are fine sometimes, but I wouldn't want people to think that's the only way they can do things, because we've seen a lot of victories that have been won politically in Warrington, Norfolk and other areas where people have argued, used their democratic rights and abilities, and we've seen it in East Bristol and elsewhere, and things have been stopped or delayed or taken out altogether and dispensed with. But of course, there are times where the legal thing's really important, particularly when you've got things where it looks like they're breaking the law or. And I think that it may well, as we've seen in Tower Hamlets just recently as well, that using the court, some people try to do that, and but they can only see, judges have to rule on the law point, on the very particular point. So, the issue of, is it the right thing to happen? Is it democratic? And also handing it over to a judge to make a decision rather than the demos and the public. We need to be concerned about that, and that's one of the problems that's happened in American politics. Far too many lawyers arguing about litigating things rather than the democratic spirit, which now we've seen some more come out again of, which is good. And interestingly, attempts to keep shutting people up legally there as well. And that's when everyone's just trying to use the law courts or judges to silence one another or to do. So that's a concern I've got. Also, with the devolution, ever-increasing devolution, trying to take the locus of power away from parliamentary scrutiny, and Keir Starmer doesn't like Westminster, we prefer Davos, but the more they get that out into a devolved thing and locally they can dispense with it, is less scrutiny, less attention. People don't really understand what's going on, the difference between county decisions and, some mayors and why mayors were brought in and not in the local authorities and councillors, and how all those things play out. And, people have got a lot of things on, and you see all these measures, and these councils and authorities, we should remind ourselves, in Oxford, well, they'll do it. They'll just try and gaslight you. They've got a legal team, and they'll bleed you out because they know that they can go longer than you can. This is with our money. But people are strong and they recognise that. And so we'd encourage people like in Oxford and elsewhere to stand for local elections, get involved, challenge that. They're coming up again in May. And the more that we have our voices heard and also do calls to action and tell our MPs, tell local councillors, say that our votes depend on it, and or stand and say this is the way we want to see things. The way that we can make sure that what we want to see happens is to get involved and become a leader. And that can be locally, regionally and nationally. Don't rely on any group to save us. We all need to be part of that.
We're seeing since the lockdowns more people not working, claiming sickness benefits. What do you think we can do about that?
It's a terrible situation that what's happened is that, kids not being back at school. We've got a horrible situation with, 5 million people not working in Britain. And that's because we got this crazy situation. We had work from home. It's all right to stay at home. And then, what's the big thing? Work. Who really wants to work? Problem is, there's a disincentive, right? You can be on benefits. And if you want to come off benefits and work for those that can, it's no incentive because you end up not getting as much from working. So we need to have a dynamic economy where people are paid well, where people make a lot of profits, and we have that growth. And we need to dispense with the myriad of benefits that are keeping Britain sick. There's also a problem with the worried well and the idea that we're all at risk and we're all vulnerable and that the old idea of resilience and being robust and stoic and going for it without parodying it, that is important, and that work is good and important and decent and informs much of it. But also, we don't want just dead-end jobs. We want people to be creative and transform the world through their activities and be part of that kind of exciting dynamic. And they need to be paid properly for it. And this is also speaks to the question of, there's too many millions of people not paying, and the lockdowns had a lot to do with that consequences. The lockdowns and the COVID-only NHS service, which has now meant we've got millions waiting on waiting lists, people waiting for hours in ambulances, outside A&Es, people being treated or not in corridors and cupboards. This is outrageous. We need to have a whole addressing of the health and care service here, of our economy, making it more efficient, getting rid of a lot of the bureaucracy, like in the public sector as well, having a bit more of a European model where you have a merged, combined private and public at source health service. Germany, individual rooms, great service. France, different but interesting. There's no reason why we can't utilise these things in a really smart way. And we need to get to grips with all of this pronto, right? We're serious people that want to do this because it's the things that we were proud of in this country. And I think back and I think about, the things like the Butler Education Act, the things that happened after the Second World War, after the First and Second World Wars, but education, the health system, they've become a problem now. Our education system's become ideological. Excellence, quality standards are being dispensed with. We're being told we're all mad, bad and dangerous. We've done terrible things around the world, and we've got this ideological thing going on. And great schools like Michaela sometimes pilloried, but we see, and thankfully with academies and others, there's other great schools like East London School of Science and others, that there's some really good schools that have come out around academies. We need to allow excellence to flourish, to inspire people with it, and not have these limits and restrictions. And that legacy of lockdowns and also in terms of ongoing health impacts and some mental health issues and what it's done to our children, it's shocking and it's unacceptable. And we say never again, but also how do we now address these things? And that's one of the things that when I'm thinking at night and in the morning about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing and why we're still organised and what we want to do, is to make sure never again, but also how can we do all this better and do it together?
Just finally on this subject, the UK Health Security Agency has bought 5 million bird flu jabs, even though there's not really much evidence that bird flu will transfer to humans. What are your thoughts on this kind of pandemic preparedness approach?
Wow. UK HSA, I mean, all sorts of things have been coming out as well about what was known by who at the time with the last set of jabs and procedures, and the things that were not made clear to everyone at the time. Is this another entity that is not fit for purpose? Or what is the criteria? How are they making decisions? Look, we talked about risk. There's kind of a risk-averse approach with me. Sometimes people are too sort of trigger happy around risk and fear and but there's also a thing where I think we need to take stock. I mean, we've had this whole thing with mad cow's disease. We saw it before. It was like being floated about bird flu. We need calm. We need to be resolute. We need to be reasoned and reasonable and rational, and we need to interrogate what kind of risk there is, and we need to assess and evaluate it and game it out. But so much of this is always done on projections, with some academic doing a projection, and if this happens, then that could happen. And then we're told this is the science. That is a flawed approach. That's why in America you've now got Jay Bhattacharya and others in key positions that are going to be coming in, because, sensible, brilliant medics and scientists that have got ground experience, but are not just academics at Imperial College saying this is what's going to happen to people. And I just think that we are going to keep fighting. Well, I know we're going to keep fighting to make sure that there's a sensible approach. And I think post-January, as we get in, we're going to have a good Christmas and a New Year. But from January onwards, everything's going to change at a faster rate again. And I'm excited about that. And those weak authoritarians should take note. I'm not sure if they're watching this and how much they take note, but I know their spads do. And I know they got their eyes on us. And I know some of the others who like to keep an eye on things like the CDU, the Counter Disinformation Unit, you know, spy units that have spied on our journalists and medics and citizens. And what we had, you know, unbelievable, the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, had a rapid response unit to shut people down. This is not what we're having in Britain. And, you know, from our words to their ears, get ready for change, because, you know, we've had enough of all of this, and we need to get Britain back to a position where the things that really count and matter get dealt with, right? We need to live in a safe country, but safe from the point of view of we've got traditions and history and values of freedom and enlightenment. And, you know, we didn't talk about it, but also our borders have controls. We should be able to decide, and I'm a big advocate of people coming from all around the world, but I want people to bring value to Britain, and I want them to be part of Britain and British values and society. And integration is really important, not, or we're going to come here, disrespect everything that you're about, you know, blatantly take liberties, and then at your expense. No, that's not how it works. That doesn't happen if you go to other countries that are proud of, you know, and they're doing things. You want to go and make money in Dubai or Singapore, as we talked about before, or other places. You then also abide by their rules and customs and laws. And if you don't, you find out very quickly what that means in Malaysia and elsewhere. Now, I'm not advocating some of those punishments, but be clear, this is something that's really important in Britain as well. We need to take control of you know, our borders and our public sector and our private sector. And we need a big national discussion about our values and principles and enlightenment and freedom and all the things we've been talking about today. And I'm welcoming more ability to do that. And I'd encourage any of your viewers to get involved with Together and for us all to be able to do that.
Alan Miller, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.